So next up, actually from Northern Ireland, we have a care campaigner who's going to tell us about their campaign in Northern Ireland to have a care partner scheme, but also the introduction of the care partner scheme and how it's working. Martina Derry, give a round of applause, please. Beautifully timed, Martina. Thanks very much.
I'm just going to go up here, if that's okay. Hopefully I don't break anything down here. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for the invite, Magella, and it's lovely to be here. It's very emotional, you know, obviously hearing everybody's story. I have one of my own as well, but I have a couple of pictures up here, and the one at the very top left-hand side, sorry, I'm trying to navigate paper here as well, is my beautiful mum and myself just prior to the pandemic. So I live in Northern Ireland. My mummy actually was from the south of Ireland. She was one of 14 children in a 2-bedroom house, so pretty much a traditional Irish family. So she's from sort of just outside Carlingford, if anybody knows that area. So Galtram's land, up in near the Cooley Mountains. So I'll give you a little bit of background to myself, if that's okay. So I started off when my mummy went into a care home in 2013. And I had got some families together in the care home. So it was a care home of about 60 residents. And we decided to start up a relative support group. And it was all very informal, nothing formal at all. So we would have just met every couple of weeks and every quarter. And we always had a formal kind of meeting in a local hotel, which was great. And there was lots of different experience, you know, within that group. You know, there was somebody who was a social worker, you know, somebody worked in the health and social care trusts, and I work in IT, so I have nothing to do with health and social care at all. But, and then one of the husbands of a resident, he actually was one of the commissioners in his former day. So we had lots of different experience. You know, if something went wrong, we always knew, you know, we could rely on each other, especially around processes and procedures and things like that in care homes, because there's so much of it. So anyhow, the 23rd of March came in 2020, and that was such a devastating day, because prior to that day, you know, I would have visited my mum a couple of times every day, sort of dealt with her personal care and hygiene. I would have put my mum to bed every night. You know, that was just the routine. And then that day came, so it was all kind of hands off. However, it didn't kind of stop us, because our family went to the window, and luckily my mummy was on a ground floor. So my heart breaks, you know, for those residents that were on a second floor, third floor, because their families wouldn't have got to see them like we got to see my mum on the ground floor. So we went to her window a couple of times every day, and then my husband and I went to the care home every night around 9:30, 10 o'clock. And that was for the full 9 months, you know, when lockdown started. But a little bit of history around this. You know, in July 2020, my mummy was hospitalised. And it was nothing actually to do with COVID, it was to do with a seizure. And she had a history of those. So she went to Craigavon Area Hospital, and that was my first time being in her company after, you know, 15 weeks of lockdown. I have the word neglect up here. So when my mummy was in hospital, she was in hospital for 2 weeks. But I couldn't believe the state of her personal care and hygiene. You know, so I had asked, because I knew the procedures. My mummy went back to the care home, and I asked the care home and the local trust to carry out an adult safeguarding investigation. So neglect was confirmed around my mummy's personal care and hygiene. Then in September 2020, the care partner guidance was introduced in Northern Ireland. And it was a really positive idea on paper. So me being me, I contacted the care home and I said, what are the care partner arrangements? So I'll come back to that in a moment. So in the meantime, in August, sort of through to October 2020, I decided, after seeing my mummy and seeing the neglect around the very, very basics of care, I contacted a human rights lawyer in the north. And I said, society has opened up. I can't believe the state that I found my mummy in when she was in hospital, and I want this challenged through the courts over the visiting restrictions. So I started taking out a human rights legal challenge. For a couple of reasons, it was delayed until the October 2020. I had spoken to the director of the care home, once the care partner guidance was introduced, and all I got was, it's likely going to be the following spring or summer. Now, I was horrified, but I knew in the background, I'm going to challenge this all through the courts. So then in December 2020, we buried my mother-in-law, who was battling cancer. And then the next day, 23rd of December came, I got a phone call from the care home. Again, nothing to do with COVID, which is what I thought. So the telephone call had said my mummy was being rushed to hospital. She had high heart rate. Again, my mummy had a history of that, so I didn't think anything different. And I go to the hospital again. And then she passed away 2 weeks later. And it was only after that that I requested my mummy's hospital records. And I noticed in her admission form that my mummy was going into hospital with suspected COVID. Now, I kind of thought I'll delve deeper just to make sure that I've read the correct information here. So I requested the 999 call, which is normally made from a nursing home, to the Northern Ireland Ambulance Service. And part of it was redacted, but I could see my mother was clearly going into the hospital with suspected COVID. Now, we all know everybody's got a duty of care. Anyhow, I have been campaigning for care partners in Northern Ireland, and I'll pick this up later on another slide. But I am one of the Bereaved Families for Justice Northern Ireland group. I'm not sure if you've heard of us, but I'm one of the 2 campaign leads for that group. We are actually part of the UK COVID Bereaved Families for Justice group, and that group has got about 6,000 members in it. They're an absolutely amazing group of people that I've met. I'm actually part of their central campaign team. Now, this is the group. There's a photo up there, the third down. It's the wall with all the red hearts. I'm not sure if you've ever seen that on TV. It's all over social media. I mean, it's the wall, across from Westminster in London. And this is the group that I'm part of that has put Boris Johnson under that much pressure. He has called a UK-wide public inquiry, which includes, thankfully, Northern Ireland, England and Wales, Scotland and Wales. So we have been campaigning long and hard for a public inquiry. We were looking at our own devolved public inquiry, but I am grateful that we are having one, even though we're part of the UK, because I will make sure that our families are heard. So we've been granted core participant status, and if anybody here is from the legal field, you'll know that that means that we have a legal role in the public inquiry. So there's 130, just to put that into perspective, there was 130 groups in Northern Ireland, across the UK, 130 groups that applied for that kind of status for the first module in the public inquiry. And only 30 groups were granted core participant status by the chair of the inquiry. who's a retired judge. And there was only 3 groups in Module 1 from Northern Ireland, and our group was one of those 3. So we feel that that's a huge achievement in itself. So that has started from last year. But like most people, we all know across the island of Ireland, there's been so many public inquiries. But we are just really hoping for, some kind of accountability. I would hope that lessons are learned should we face another pandemic. And I really want to see a legislative change. I want care partners, legislated, because nobody in care homes or in hospitals should be left on their own without a family member. At the end of the day, we are their eyes and ears. We are actually the experts. So you've got specialists out there, but we're the experts, families are. Could you just go to the next slide? Yeah, sorry. So a little bit about care partners. Like I said, it was a really good idea. It looked good on paper. It was introduced by the Department of Health in Northern Ireland, and it was published in September 2020. I believe it came about because of the pressure from the public. It was really introduced to respect human rights of residents and their families. It was somebody who had, somebody could be a care partner who had a long-standing relationship with a care home resident. So that could have been somebody like myself, with my mum. It could have been somebody, a son and their mum or father. And initially in the guidance, it was allowing up to 2 care partners per resident. And that's how the guidance started off. It was to provide support. So what kind of support was that? That was emotional support. It didn't mean that you had to go in and feed the person. You could go in and feed the person if you wanted to. But it was really, but you could also go in to hold their hand. That's the emotional support that was part of it. Psychological support or physical support. It was really a risk-assessed and risk-managed approach. So all the risks were looked at by the experts within the Department of Health and Public Health Agency. There was a difference in care partner visits and normal visiting. So normal visiting was done at a distance, like 2 metres social distance. Care partner visits were a little bit different. You could provide, go in and hold their hand, you could provide up close and personal care if you needed to. Can you just move to the next slide, please? Thanks. So care homes in the guidance, when it was first introduced in September 2020, it was given them about 6 weeks to implement it, which I thought was a pretty reasonable time frame, given that we had been locked out of care homes for about 6 months at this stage. Families campaigned though, so I was one of the lead campaigners that went to Stormont that first year in 2020, because what we found is, some of the care homes were not letting care partners in, and one of the reasons they said they weren't tested. We were happy to be tested, at the local testing centre, but that wasn't enough for some reason. So we decided to campaign. The media was behind us. We had a lot of media support, which was great. And then we went back a second year to Stormont. And we did that in November 2021. Even though my mummy had already passed away, I knew families were still going to windows, which I thought was absolutely shocking. There was no need for that because we already knew from the care partners being introduced that it was a risk-assessed and risk-managed approach. So then they started to change the guidance again. But just initially, when care partners was introduced, there was no testing of the care partners at that time. So we continued to campaign, and what we had reported back to the Department of Health and the Public Health Agency was that, care homes are locking families out because they're in an outbreak, or the surge level in the country, has changed, and we need the guidance to change. So they did change the guidance, and that last line there says that it had changed on the 15th of January 2021. It was too late for me, and my mummy had passed away a couple of days, before that. But I know other families, it has hugely benefited, in the north of Ireland. Just want to move to the next slide, yeah. Thank you. Can you all still hear me okay? Yeah, that's okay. So What was the reactions of care home providers? It's probably fair to say it was a bit of a mixed bag. You know, some wanted clarification from the Department of Health or the local health trust. I know my mummy's care home wanted clarification when it was first introduced. I thought it was very clear, you know, in the guidance. But some care homes felt that it wasn't. Some implemented it very successfully. And some didn't encourage care partners, whilst others did encourage families. Funding was provided to support visiting. And what I discovered, you know, after my mummy passed away under a Freedom of Information request, was that some care homes were actually getting paid by the state, but yet and all, they didn't allow families in. So I would like to think that that will come out in the public inquiry, because funding is one area that will be looked at in the public inquiry. I'm nearly on my last slide. Yeah, I'm getting eyes here that I'm running out of time. So we're on the last slide. Yeah. So Care Partners today, it does help families access their loved ones, which is great. I personally feel that, you know, our group, even though we're small and informal, you know, has made a huge difference to many families and residents across Northern Ireland. If we find a care home is not compliant, then it would be reported to the Department of Health or QIA, which is the equivalent to, I think it's HICWA in the south of Ireland here, and the Public Health Agency as well. Some families are enjoying unlimited access, which is great. That's the way it should be, because we know we've got all the critical tools to make this work. The risks are all assessed, and they visit, you know, every day. Some of them visit a couple of times every day, which is great. Some families are still restricted, but what I've said to them before is, you know, it's really important that families stay informed. You know, you've so many people that you can turn to for advice. Please don't be afraid to ask questions and challenge equality, because every life does matter. One of the other points I wanted to say there was the last two bullet points on that slide. Even though Care Partners was introduced in September 2020 in care homes, when my mummy was being admitted to hospital, I remember saying to the nurse on the COVID ward, I'm getting into the COVID ward because I need to be with my mummy. I'm my mummy's care partner. Now, I used that line genuinely thinking that I was my mummy's care partner, even though I didn't get into the care home, but I was getting into the hospital. But I didn't realise until February 2022, it was only extended to all the hospitals in Northern Ireland. However, I got in December 2020. So thankfully, I was there with my mummy, you know, in her dying days and weeks. So one last point I want to make. I've spoke to Magella a couple of times, you know, and I was asking her, is the structure in Northern Ireland similar to Southern Ireland? And she had explained to me that, yeah, about 80% of your care homes here are, you know, private, in the private sector. And it's a little bit more actually in Northern Ireland. We've 90% of the care homes that are privately funded, private care homes. But they're also state funded. And I looked into human rights and things like that when I was taking out the challenge. I was actually on the phone to the Human Rights Commissioner of day one. But when they are state funded, they're known as public authorities. And when the state tells you that, you know, the discretion is left with care home providers, well, we all know that discretion must be monitored and it must be proportionate as well. So just bear that in mind. So thank you again for inviting me today.